enhancing growth and production, or trapping or deterring pests. And so that pretty much stays with the new idea, but it's looking at it kind of from a different point of view or through a different lens. The new one talks about companion planting as an approach to gardening, where you look at the whole garden as an ecosystem comprising many different complex layers of plants, fungi, animals, insects, all of which are connected in a massive web of life. And so we're looking at a lot of different things that will impact the plants and everything that's growing alongside them. The old theory versus the new theory, how are they different? The old one really had no scientific data to back up the plant combinations. They were based mostly on what, quote, worked well together, or plants that, quote, liked each other. Sometimes it was successful, sometimes not. And it was based basically on folklore, conjecture, or the best guess of a gardener. The new system looks at plants that live in communities and affect one another. Some of the effects are more beneficial for the plants, and that's why we tend to want to use those. And why is this effect happening? Can we see what the link is between the two? And it's also based on research. So someone actually went out and planted these plants side by side versus not planting them side by side, and then looked at what happened to the plants over the growing season, or even several growing seasons. Modern companion planting is based on how they react to each other to improve the overall ecosystem of the garden. And it takes into account all the organisms, from the tiniest microbes living in the soil or on the soil or in the air to the tallest tomato plant. It is about pairing plants so that one plant provides an ecosystem benefit to another plant. And it takes into consideration the entire ecosystem where the plant is growing. The more we pay attention to the connections between plants, the better gardeners we will be. Some of the connections that plant partners are based on, in other words, what do some plants do for other ones that make this a good system? Resource sharing and competition. So are there resources out there that plants need that they can share between themselves? And that sounds kind of funny because we always think about plants competing for resources. The improved nutrient availability and absorption, chemical messaging systems. Plants really do, in essence, talk to each other. And this sounds kind of funny, but it's true. And then fungal associations with the plants that are there for all plants. And the final one is allelopathy, which means some plants actually inhibit the growth of other plants. And that might sound kind of contradictory too, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. Let's take a look at each one of these things that we're looking to improve in the web in our gardens. Resource competition and sharing. There's limited light, water, and nutrients in a given area for plant growth. Plants must compete for these resources, and they do so by adapting to the amount of light, by adjusting their height, the size and shape of their root systems, if they're looking for nutrients and water in the ground, the plant shape, the kinds of leaves a plant has. And so therefore we have a really large variety of different plants and very different ways of growing. Tall, big leaf plants, short, big leaf plants, plants with enormous root systems, plants with very shallow root systems, and so on. For example, resource sharing in the forest on the right, trees bring up water and nutrients from deeper in the ground than many of the plants that are growing underneath them. But in turn, the plants, when they die and decompose, they offer nutrients back to the trees. So it's kind of a sharing, symbiotic kind of relationship. The second one is improved nutrient availability and absorption. And that is things like the nutrients that a plant is able to get at in the soil depends on a number of different things, such as the structure of the soil, how much of the nutrient is in the soil, is it bound to the soil chemically, how mobile is it, does it move easily through water or air or whatever. And one plant can improve the ability of another plant to absorb nutrients by improving the soil structure, by adding organic matter, or maybe breaking up the soil with an extensive root system. Crops like green manures are often used to do this, and certain plants are able to actually pull nutrients from the soil more easily than others. And plants like the legume family on the right here actually have the ability to develop what they call nitrogen fixing nodules on the roots, where they can extract nitrogen, which is a very important plant element, out of the air and store it in these nodules in the roots. Then when they can share it with other plants when they're living, or they can deposit it in the soil. When the plant dies, it stays in the soil, and then it's available for other plants. So the next one is chemical messaging systems. I said before, plants can, quote, talk to each other through chemical signals, and they're used to often alert other plants in the area of an attack by insects or diseases, and kind of literally through the chemical message say, get ready, get tough, I'm being attacked and you are next. They can also talk to insects by chemical messages, requesting the help of beneficial insects to prey on harmful insects. These messages can travel, fractions of an inch between roots of certain plants and other roots, or with the help of these mycorrhizal systems, it can actually extend yards away from the plant. So some plants can send messages to grow faster or slower if they're under crowded conditions. Trees actually send messages back and forth to each other. And probably the most numerous messages are these fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. And they're on the roots of almost all plants, and they act as messengers for the plant, and they also act as like a go-between to absorb the nutrients and water from the soil and then pass them on to the roots of the plants. So the actual part of the plant that's getting all the moisture, nutrients, and nutrition from the soil is actually these mycorrhizal fungi associations. And without that, the plant is far less healthy. And they also work sort of like a telephone network, passing messages along by chemicals. And the last thing that we look for of how a plant could maybe help another plant is the ability of a plant to produce and release chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. It can be in any part of the plant. It could be in the soil around the plant. In other words, the plant leaves it in the soil after it's no longer there. It can, the allelopathic chemicals can inhibit the root or system growth so that the plant is stunted. It can actually kill a plant. It can keep a seed from germinating. It can restrict nutrient uptake. So the plant is growing there, but it can't get any more nutrients. So then it dies, or it becomes very stunted. Or it can affect that mycorrhizal fungi that's related to the plant. So the plant can't use that to grow. It can't get much bigger, or can't grow very well. Most of us are pretty familiar, if you're a gardener, with black walnut trees and their effect on the soil, and that it makes many different kinds of plants either die in the presence of it, or become very stunted and grow very poorly. Some other common allelopathic plants are garlic, mustard, and Canada goldenrod. In nature, you know that both of these plants spread very easily and very thickly, and you have an area that seems to be nothing but that plant. And that's because they kind of inhibit any other plant from growing there. This sounds like it's a bad thing for a garden, but actually it's not, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some other common plants that have allelopathic effects are rye, oats, sunflowers, rice, alfalfa, cucumbers, and quite a few more. So the benefits of companion planting or mixed planting strategies enhance the garden by reducing pest pressure, reducing weed pressure, reducing disease pressure, improving soil fertility and structure, improving pollination, increasing beneficial insects for biological control, and they also improve aesthetics. A nice looking garden with lots of plants in it always looks nice. So it's not that we just have to plant for strictly scientific reasons. Many of these also make very pretty gardens when they're done. Let's see. One of the things we're going to be talking about all night tonight is diversity, and that the wider variety of plants we have in a given area, the more stable the environment becomes. Specific interactions we talked about so far, there's an environmental advantage to many of those different plants growing together. If you ever visit a prairie or a wild area, you'll find many different plants growing together or in succession over a season. The diversity of plants means that there is a diversity of insects who use those plants, which in turn supports a diversity of birds and other mammals and other living beings that depend on the insects. The varied plant forms, the seeds that they're produced, the availability of nesting sites, for example, for other birds or animals. And the advantage of this great diversity is that if one plant species is having a bad year, there are others to carry on. Our modern farming practices uses monocultures of plants. We have a big field of corn, then a field of soybeans, etc. So if a disease or an insect enters that field that is feeding on or affecting that one crop, it's going to be able to spread really quickly through the whole field because there's a whole lot of plants out there for it to infect or eat. And so modern farmers have had to use herbicides and pesticides to control disease and insects. And the same is true in our small scale vegetable gardens also, that if we don't have a lot of diversity, let's say you plant a lot of tomatoes and little else, you're going to be attracting all the bugs that like tomatoes, all the diseases, the tomatoes, and if it starts in one part of your garden, it's likely to spread to another. However, if you mix up the plants, the diseases and insects are less likely to spread easily, and it gives an advantage that the plants can provide for each other, some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to look at 7 different ways that plants can be partnered in order to protect or enhance the web that grows in our garden. And if you're wondering, well, I thought she was going to talk about, you know, plant this with that. We are going to be doing that, but I'm kind of using these 7 things as a reason for planting certain plants together. So let's look first at, need to move here, soil preparation and conditioning. How do you prepare your soil for planting? Do you till it into a fine powder? Do you hand spade it? Then most people walk all over it again to seed or set transplants, defeating the work you just did. As we study soil and plant growth, we are finding that tilling, either by hand or by machine, is doing more harm than good. It breaks up the mycorrhizal structures in the soil, destroys the homes of beneficial soil-dwelling organisms, and destroys the soil structure itself. The first bullet is something to seriously consider. Planting in beds, whether you use a raised bed or not versus rows, is really something to think about. Planting bed is defined as a strip of garden no wider than 4 feet so that you can reach in from both sides. And it can be as long a bed as you want, depends how far you want to walk to get around the bed. But even if you have, like, say, an acre garden, dividing it into beds rather than planting everything in rows is going to give you the advantage that you don't ever have to walk on the soil that you're raising the vegetables in. You only walk around the beds on the outside. Therefore, you don't have to till. If you add organic matter or compost or leaf mold or chopped leaves as a mulch, you're adding the fertilizer and conditioning the soil. And then you just put your seeds or transplants into the soil, disturbing it as little as possible. And then you are not disturbing the whole web of life that lives in the underground part of your garden. It provides for minimal soil disturbance and is better for the soil all around. We're going to talk a little bit about cover crops, and in case people don't understand quite what cover crops are, I want to describe that a little bit so you're not lost. Non-harvested crops grown before or after a vegetable crop or a farm crop. So the cover crop itself does not have any value as far as producing food or being harvested for financial gain. It does though have very, very serious non-financial rewards to using it. There are warm season cover crops, and these are planted in the spring, either before a crop that's planted later, like a warm season vegetable, like tomatoes or peppers or something, or it's planted in an area that's left fallow for that growing season. And it's just the cover crop that grows there. The cool season cover crops are usually planted in the late summer or early fall after a crop is harvested. And then they're allowed to grow either until the following spring or until they're killed by frost. Some cover crops are killed by frost, others survive the winter, and that's an important consideration to take into when you are looking at what you're going to use for a cover crop. If you are going to have to till it over in the spring in order to kill it, then we get into the trade-off between tilling and using cover crops. If it's killed by frost, you can just leave it there and plant into the crop residue the next time you are planting seeds or transplants. The advantages of a cover crop is that they reduce soil erosion, and many farmers use it for that reason because it does keep the soil in place during the winter. It brings up nutrients from deep in the soil depending on what plant you use for your cover crop. And it also provides organic matter, which can be used either in compost piles or just left on top of the garden as a natural mulch. And they improve soil structure when you add all that organic matter in. So it's really important that people understand the value of cover crops and what they can be used for. So if you want to have plant partners that help in soil conditioning, some of the things you can do: oats can be planted in the fall. They are winter killed, so you don't have to worry about tilling them under or anything in the spring. You basically just flatten the stems and plant right into what is there, what's left of the plants. If you are getting straw to mulch your garden, basically that's what you're getting is the oats, and you can grow your own rather than having to pay and haul the straw to your garden. Buckwheat is another one. This is a warm season cover crop. It's planted in the spring, and then you want to cut that off either with like a string trimmer or a loppers or a mower just as it starts to form flowers. If you let it go, it's going to seed and it's going to become a weed by itself. And winter rye, that one's planted in the fall. It does not die over the winter. So it has to be turned under or mowed really, really close to the ground just as it begins to flower also in the spring. So those are some cover crops that can be used for soil conditioning. In other words, they include organic matter into the soil. Crimson clover, and I'm not talking about the red clover that's used as a forage crop. That's another one for soil conditioning. It fixes nitrogen, so you're adding nutrients to the soil also. It's killed below -10 degrees. So for us here in central part of Wisconsin, we probably will not have to worry about terminating that crop in the spring. Winter wheat is another winter hardy one. That one's going to have to be mowed or cut or tilled in some way in the spring. And another one for soil conditioning is cowpeas or southern peas, and those are winter killed. So you don't have to worry about terminating those.
Hey, Donna, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Someone asked online, he said, I planted a fall cover crop on my garden this fall, and I would like to avoid tilling it this spring because of the damage it does to the soil network, as you mentioned. Is an herbicide my only other option?
No, what you need to do is mow it really close to the ground, and it probably will not come back with much vigor after that, but you have to get really close to the ground. So take a string trimmer or whatever and just literally scalp the soil.
Thank you.
Okay, if you want to add more nitrogen to the soil, garden beans, this is a partnership now. We're starting to talk about companion planting. Plant garden beans alongside potatoes. And while the garden beans, like green beans and wax beans, are not huge producers of nitrogen, they do add nitrogen. And when they did the study, they found that the tuber size increased because the beans were able to share nitrogen with the potatoes. So either alternating rows of beans and potatoes or alternating bean plants and potato plants in the same row or the same square if you're doing square put gardening, and plant the potatoes maybe a few weeks before the beans, or you can plant them at the same time, but not the beans before the potatoes because they'll probably overtake them. Another pair for nitrogen transfer is peas. Again, peas are in the legume family, and planting those with lettuce because they're both cool season crops. And so the taller peas will shade the lettuce to help lengthen the time it can be harvested before it bolts and becomes bitter. Do it by planting each row of peas with a row of lettuce on either side or alternating rows of peas and lettuce. Fava beans and sweet corn. Fava beans can produce 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre. They can be grown as a cover crop before the corn is planted, or plant it several weeks before the corn in alternating rows, or 2 rows of beans with 1 row of corn in between. Cowpeas and many kinds of transplants. Cowpeas have been shown to reduce weeds and increase nitrogen to pepper plants, for example. Use cowpeas with transplants because it is slightly allelopathic. So if you try to plant seeds along with cowpeas, the seeds might not germinate. Plant the peas early and then add transplants when the weather warms. Some cowpeas are edible, so if you wish to get a harvest out of them besides using them as a cover crop, choose like a black-eyed peas that has better flavor for eating. Edamame, which is a immature soybean, is also a legume crop, and it's different from the soybeans that farmers plant in their fields. You could plant this in the spring and then later plant kale, collards, spinach, and chard for fall harvesting of those plants. Whoopsie, where are we going here? Come on. There we go. If you want to do some breaking up of some heavy soil, like in the area where I garden here, we have pretty heavy clay. And so if you're starting a new garden and it seems like you could almost go out there and mold pots out of your soil, some of the ones that are good for breaking up that heavy clay are buckwheat, forage radishes, and a kind of turnip that has long roots. Root plants produce what's called root exudates, and without getting into a big chemical explanation of everything, they have the ability to alter the chemical and physical properties of soil. And buckwheat is particularly good in helping particles of soil to not stick together as much. And that's what we've got when we have clay soil. Forage radishes are not the daikon type radishes. This is a special radish. They have a long tap root, so that forces spaces in the soil when it grows, and that allows air and water to get into the soil, which can be a problem with clay soils. They also pull nutrients from as much as 6 feet or more by the tap root, and have many other fine root hairs to also kind of break up the soil. And when they die, then that space where the root was offers a channel for water and nutrients to get into the soil. If you're going to do these as probably in a fallow crop for one season, sow the seed thinly in the late summer or early fall, and allow at least 6 weeks before the temperatures dip to 20 degrees, which will kill the radish. Turnips, again, it's a special variety bred for their long roots that rather than for eating, and you would plant that the same as the forage radishes. Okay, let's talk about weed management then, and how can we do that with plants? Plant partnering can reduce weeds in the garden 2 ways. One, by acting as a living mulch that crowds or shades out weeds, or by allelopathy, which inhibits the growth of weed seeds in your garden. Living mulches have several purposes in the garden besides weed control. In addition to competing with weeds for resources and blocking light to keep the weed seeds from germinating, living mulches can draw in pollinators as well as beneficial insects, depending on what you choose for your living mulch. They can supply nitrogen if that's the kind of plant you use, and also because each plant hosts different mycorrhizal organisms, it provides a variety of nutrients and water to your garden plants. Some may even deter pest insects. Living mulches are used by alternating rows of veggie crops or by planting the living mulch plants underneath tall veggie plants, by using them in paths or walkways as a mulch instead of straw, or by planting under trees in orchards or under or around vines in vineyards. The pairing of a vegetable and a crop plant takes a little bit of planning. The perennial living mulches work well with perennial plants and annuals with annual garden plants. And the heights of the crop plants and the mulches need to be considered as well. So it's a little bit tricky, but I'll try and give you some examples here of things that work. Let's see. You generally, when you're doing anything that's an allelopathic crop, remember that you don't want to plant small seeds, direct sow small seeds into an area that has allelopathic living mulch, because there's a chance that they won't germinate. Generally, the bigger the seed, the more likely it is to germinate, such as a bean seed or a corn seed or a squash seed. But when you're talking about little tiny seeds, they do best in a place where there's not been an allelopathic plant growing previously. So let's look at some combinations. Crimson clover, again, that's not red clover, planting that with cole crops The crimson clover creates a thick mat to choke out the weeds, and it also attracts beneficial insects. It does need to be mowed before it drops its seeds, and it's winter killed below 0. So you would interplant this with rows or alternate rows of crimson clover and cole crops. Medium red clover and winter squash. A medium red clover breaks up the soil and suppresses weeds. It often winter kills in the north, so you don't have to worry about terminating it in the spring. It adds nitrogen while it's living and as it decomposes, and it has a thick root system for holding soil and attracts beneficial insects. It needs to be cut several times a season. It grows pretty hardily, but allows a squash to kind of crawl over the top of it. And this would be planted alternating strips of clover with rows of squash. White clovers, which are a little bit smaller plants than the red and the crimson and red clovers, are good to plant with strawberries or blueberries. You can grow it in the paths between strawberry rows and then mow it just before the berries are ready to be picked. Don't interplant it in the same row. You don't want it in the same row, but it would be in the paths then. It doesn't have to be mowed as often as grass if you plant it between blueberry plants, and it also provides nitrogen to either the strawberries or the blueberries. White clover and tomatoes or other tall veggies. You can use it with those tall veggies also in orchards under trees. The smaller white clover varieties like Dutch white clover need a lot less mowing than the larger varieties that could grow up to maybe a foot tall. It's winter hardy and more shade tolerant than some other mulches. One study found that the weed control it provided was equivalent to an herbicide application. And another found that it controlled cabbage aphids because it drew the aphids, predators, and parasitoids. So we'll talk about those kind of insects a little bit later. So those would be plants that you can plant not only in your vegetable garden, but also around fruit plants. Subterranean clover, which is a special variety. If you know peanuts, when the flower flowers, then the flower bends down and goes into the soil and it grows the peanut. Subterranean clover works the same way. It's winter killed at 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very low growing, doesn't need mowing in orchards, but needs to be mowed in vegetable gardens to keep it from reseeding. It works well with sweet corn, summer squash, cabbage, snap beans, broccoli, leeks, and tomatoes. It has some allelopathic properties, so it's best not to be used where you're going to grow something from seed. Plant it in between rows of veggies, and it has been proven to be better at weed control than conventional herbicides. Oats and tall veggie crops. Oats are an inexpensive mulch and an excellent weed barrier, and they are also winter killed. The only drawback is that it's a pretty tall plant at about 4 feet, and it needs to be mowed regularly or cut down if it's planted with vegetable crops or berries. If you leave the residue on the ground as a mulch, it's allelopathic, so it's best used in areas where transplants are used instead of seeds. And if you are using bale straw as garden mulch, it's probably what you're getting is the oat stems. So you could grow it live and not have to buy the straw. You can sow oats between strawberry rows in late summer or early fall, and then the next spring, the oats will be dead, and then you just roll the residue down and you have a mat over the soil, which is good for people walking and picking the berries, and also to protect the soil as a mulch. Winter rye and asparagus. This is one I'm going to maybe try this year. You plant the rye after the asparagus harvest is over. It will die back in the summer heat because it doesn't like the heat very well, but it helps in weed control and protects the soil. If you use this, you have to provide a little more water to the asparagus because the rye does compete for resources. It also works really well, according to reports, to keep dandelions from germinating in the fall. So if you don't like all those dandelions in your asparagus patch. Cowpeas and peppers. Cowpeas provide shade from the leaves and they have a mild allelopathic effect to keep weeds from sprouting. Pepper production increased when cowpeas were used as a living mulch. And the last one, yellow mustard and summer squash. Yellow mustard increased the yields of summer squash and reduced the number of aphids, whiteflies, and squash silverleaf disease. It's winter killed at 25 degrees Fahrenheit. You would plant it in the spring as a living mulch among the squash and or in the fall to keep the fall weeds from germinating because of its allelopathic effect on the dead foliage in the fall. Its flowers are very attractive to pollinators and other beneficial insects, but you need to be sure that you cut it down before the seeds develop, or it could become the weed in your garden the following year. Allelopathic plant partners. If your garden's always being taken over by weeds, despite your best weeding efforts, winter rye may be a helpful answer. It reduces foxtail, pigweed, ragweed, and purslane germination by 43 to 100%, just to name a few of the weeds. You would put this in as a cover crop in late summer or fall, and mow or cut it in the spring and leave it in place as a mulch. It will not work with seeded crops because it is allelopathic, but transplants will really enjoy the reduced weed pressure, and so will you. Oats will do the same thing for sweet potatoes if grown the season before and the stems are left as mulch. Both of these are good partners for vining crops like squash. And cucumbers and taller vegetables. Surprisingly, cucumbers are slightly allelopathic, as are other cucumber family members like watermelon. They can be grown as a cover crop under or between taller crops like tomatoes, corn, and eggplants. Again, don't plant seeds in the residue that's left in the soil. And the last seed, rapeseed, which is also called canola, is an effective weed control in potatoes. It has an extensive root system that loosens the soil and brings up nutrients. And again, just don't let it go to seed. The third thing that we're going to look at is using plants to help provide structure and support. And I've got a whole bunch of combinations here where you can actually plant two plants together. Some of these are flowers too. And then the one plant acts as a structure or device for holding up the other plant, which generally are vining plants, and that keeps the leaves and the fruits from being on the ground and being attacked by ground insects, and also by rot from the ground if you have a particularly wet season. And so you can look at these. Remember that the vining crop cannot be watermelons, full-size watermelons. You have to look at kind of the mini pumpkins, small gourds, spinach, Malabar spinach, which is a kind of a vining spinach, the smaller cucumbers, currant tomatoes, and okra. And by currant means those are the really, really tiny tomatoes. And generally the plants are described as being patio plants. And then tree kale and runner beans, which are again a kind of a smaller bean variety. Okay, pest management. This is one that I think is really interesting. Luring pests away with a trap crop that they prefer to the food crop you are growing. That's one way to use them. Hiding or masking the presence of a host plant. So if the insect is looking for the tomato in your garden and you've got something else planted around it, that has a stronger scent perhaps, or is a little kind of hiding your tomato plant, it's going to be harder for that insect to find your plant. Using plants to interfere with egg laying behaviors of pest insects, blocking pest movement. So if you have like wild areas near your garden, or your neighbor's yard is full of weeds and that sort of thing, or has a lot of nasty insects, keeping those insects from moving into your yard or your garden, and improving diversity. However, the caution is to make sure that the crop producing plant is not overtaken by the partner, and that both have adequate resources like light, water, and nutrients. So many times the plant partner is not something that you're going to harvest, so you don't want it to take over your garden, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. Some examples of this are cabbage family and collards. The collards are preferred to other cole crops by diamondback moths for egg laying, and that moth lays like the green worms, or one category of the green worms that are in your cole crops. Plant the two several feet apart, or you can put it like on the outside of your garden, or a row on one side of the garden, for example. A trap crop is usually located a little farther away, like the edge of a garden or next to a garden, if the insect you are trying to trap is pretty mobile, so it flies generally. If the insect has limited mobility, like it tends to crawl from one plant to another, then you would want to interplant the trap crop with the vegetable. Plant the trap crop a few weeks ahead of the vegetable crop, so it gets a head start on attracting any insects that arrive early. And the trap crop should be 10 to 20% the size of the vegetable crop. And then you would use insecticides if you wish, or you can pick off or vacuum off with a hand vac the pest insects that accumulate in the trap crop. Another combination is tomatoes and cowpeas. The southern green stink bugs prefer cowpeas to tomatoes. Plant the cowpeas early and several feet away, and then remove the stink bugs from the cowpeas as they collect, much like we collect Japanese beetles around here. Planting blue Hubbard squash with other squash varieties, you're sacrificing the Hubbard squash for the other varieties, and squash bugs, squash vine borers, prefer Hubbard squash to the other squash, melons, and pumpkin plants. Plant 3 to 4 weeks ahead of the crop and several feet away or along the edges of the patch. Bell peppers and hot cherry tomatoes. Pepper maggot flies prefer hot cherry tomatoes to bell peppers for egg laying. Plant around the pepper patch or along one side. Many veggies are attract flea beetles, and that's a pest that makes the plant look like it's kind of stippled or kind of almost silvery looking, because the flea beetles suck the juice out of the leaves, and then the leaves get kind of freckled or speckled. They prefer radishes, and you may have seen this on radishes in your garden, pak choi or Chinese mustard, to most of the other plants that they would eat in your garden. So you want to plant those plants between rows or alternating rows with your veggie crops. Mustard and various veggies. In the south part of the United States, harlequin bugs feed on a variety of veggies. Plant mustard several feet away around the garden to trap this plant. And strawberries and alfalfa, lygus bugs cause cat facing on strawberries, and you've probably seen this. The strawberry looks like it's kind of shriveled up or sunken in, and the seeds kind of all fall into those cracks, and it's not the nice round berry. And that's the result. Well, it could be of several things, but lygus bugs is one of the big causes of it. And so plant those close to your patch, but not in the patch, because you don't want them to get too close. And then you can vacuum the bugs off the alfalfa. You need about 2 to 3% of alfalfa plants compared with the size of your strawberry patch. Masking.
Donna?
plant. Yep.
Donna, we have a quick question. Can I ask a quick?
Sure.
All right. Somebody asked, are plant partners or living mulches incorporated into farm businesses? I don't hear of these combinations. How do farmers learn about these managements?
They probably aren't in our big scale farming operations. But if you are talking to like CSA farmers, people who grow vegetables, for like selling to farmers markets, I don't know if people know what a CSA, it's a consumer supported agriculture. So you get a box of vegetables, you pay a certain amount of money and you get a box of vegetables every week from a farmer. They are using a lot of these because they see the value of them, and they are dealing with much smaller plot sizes than the conventional farmer who has a field of 40 acres or 60 acres or more of the same crop and uses a big tractor and a combine and all that sort of thing. So yeah, you aren't seeing it as much. You are seeing farmers use cover crops though. And the other thing that's coming up with farmers a lot is the no-till practice. So you don't till your field between crops, you just plant the new crop into the residue of the old crop. That answer your question?
That sounded like a good answer to me.
Okay. So how can you keep the bugs from finding your plants that you want to protect? And companion planting or plant partners can do that also. Insects find their host plant by sight. They might like get a chemical scent, so they kind of in effect smell it. And they might also do it by feeling and tasting the plant. If you've ever watched like a butterfly, if you watched a monarch and they land on the leaves of a plant, and before they lay eggs, you know, they'll like stand there and like peel it and stuff. And, you know, that's the way they are finding out whether this is the right plant to put the egg on. So if we can interrupt the way that the insect finds your plants that you don't want eaten, that would be a good thing. And so the other thing that insects do in order to lay eggs, they have found that many of them have to land a certain number of times on the host plant before they will lay eggs. So let's say an insect has to land on the plant 7 times in a row before it's sure that it's a good place to lay an egg. So if you can mix up your vegetables and the insect has landed 6 times on the plant it wants to lay its eggs on, the 7th time it hits your tomato plant or another plant that isn't the right plant, it has to start all over again and try to find 6 touches or 7 touches before it will lay the egg. So by mixing up plants in your garden, the chances of that insect finding the right plant, say 7 times in a row, is decreased. And so you'll probably have less egg laying and therefore less larvae and less insect damage and, you know, the whole thing. So those are just some kind of interesting things about bugs. A combination here is peppers and anything in the allium or onion family. Green peach aphids are attracted to pepper plants, and they also transmit several plant viruses to peppers, which is not a good thing. So they can spread a disease from one plant to another. So if you plant onions, scallions, or garlic around or between pepper plants, that's going to kind of throw them off a little bit and make it harder for them to find a pepper plant. Zucchini and nasturtiums, they found that nasturtiums reduce the number of squash bugs and squash borers on zucchini. And it's hypothesized that it may work for winter squash too. And I've heard this before. I even read this book. If space is limited, plant a bush type of nasturtium. Some of them get really tall, some of them are not so tall. Or use a vining type if you have lots and lots of room and you can plant it in between all those squash and zucchini plants and those type of things. Besides, the nasturtiums are pretty and they're also edible, the leaves and the flowers. Chinese cabbage and green onions. Flea beetle damage on green onions can reduce or excuse me, the other way around. Green onions reduce flea beetle damage on Chinese cabbage, but not necessarily on broccoli or some of the other cole crops. You can extend the protection by using the push-pull method, and that means using plants to either pull the damaging insects away from your garden to a favorite plant, or you can use the push method, and so it brings them in around your plant to trap them there. And let's see, tomatoes and basil. Basil masks the tomatoes from thrips, which is another very tiny sucking insect that transmits tomato spotted wilt virus. The thrips also feed on onions. They prefer red over white. So keeping your onions away from tomatoes, that's one of the plant partners don't do things. Although not proven, it might help to plant basil around other tomato family plants like potatoes, eggplants, and as well as beans, celery, and other crops that might be affected by thrips. Collards and calendula. Aphids love collards and other cole crops. Calendula or pot marigolds repel the aphids and also attract some beneficial insects, which we'll talk about next. Planting cole crops among the calendula is a very pretty way to deter aphids too. Potatoes and tansy or catmint. Both tansy and catmint have strong pungent scents, making it more difficult for the insects to find the potatoes. Beware that tansy, though, is considered an invasive plant in Wisconsin, and it quickly grows lots of underground rhizomes that make it pretty hard to get rid of. So do not let it go to seed if you're going to take a chance on that, because that would spread it around to other areas in other places in your area, and then it would be an invasive plant. Both plants are perennials too, and the potatoes are annuals, and they should be moved every year. So either you have to move your trap crop with them, or you have to replant it again the following year, like from seed or something. Both of them are pretty tough plants though, so generally they would survive transplanting pretty well. Partners to interfere with egg laying. Cole crops and sage, dill, chamomile, or hyssop is a good combination to keep cabbage worm butterflies from laying their eggs on your broccoli and Brussels sprouts and those kinds of plants. Sage and hyssop are perennials that will need to be dug up and relocated to new cole planting sites. It's probably much easier to use dill or chamomile because they're, annual plants, and both of them will readily self-seed if you allow them to produce seed. I have dill growing all over my garden. A year ago, I had black swallowtail butterfly caterpillars on a lot of my dill, and I think I counted up to 50 some, and then I was starting to get confused about who I had counted and who I hadn't counted. But dill will come up, you know, like again and again. Once you get it planted one year, if you don't cut it down or use it all before it goes to seed, it'll readily come back, and it's very easy to pull. So if you have a lot of it, just let it grow and then only pull it out where you don't want it. It's a really, really good plant food pollen source for many beneficial insects. Basil is a good plant to repel egg laying of the tomato and tobacco hornworms. Alternate or plant basil plants around a tomato plant, or alternate rows of basil and then tomatoes. Be sure you leave enough room though between the plants that you have good air circulation so your tomatoes don't get diseased. Cole crops and thyme. Thyme is a low-growing plant that can be planted underneath cole crops like broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage. And it sort of reduces the egg-laying ability of imported cabbage worm and the cabbage looper. These worms can pretty quickly destroy some of your cole crops. Onions and cole crops and marigolds. Marigolds reduce egg-laying behavior of the flies' eggs that hatch into onion root maggots, and they attack onion leeks and garlic. A similar pest is known as the cabbage root maggot, and that attacks the cole crops like radishes, the root cole crops, radishes, rutabagas, and turnips. So plant those two plants in alternate rows or alternating plants between one another in the same row. And the last one is cabbage and white clover. White clover underneath cabbage plants deter cabbage rootworm maggot flies from laying their eggs. They lay them in the soil, so if you can't get to the soil, they can't lay their eggs. The cabbage were a little bit smaller in the control group, but they didn't have to apply pesticides to control the maggots. So in that way, it's probably worth it. The clover is perennial, so it has to be tilled under, or you have to leave it and plant other plants into that mulch the following years that will grow well with the white clover. Let's see.
Hey, Donna,
Mhm.
we have a question actually in person here. She's wondering, where do you find to buy the clover seed to plant?
Gosh, I don't know if I put that on the resources. One of the ones that has quite a variety is Johnny's Seed Company. And just Google Johnny's and it'll come up. They cater to vegetable farmers, you know, the small type vegetable farmers as well as big farm types, but they're really into a lot of these cover crops and microgreens and, you know, all these other things too. So I would try that one, or you can Google just the name of the, I know I put the names and the scientific names on the resource sheet of some of these clovers because there's so many different kinds. Just Google that scientific name and say seed, and you can see what you can come up with there too. Okay, next one is plant partners to impede pest movement. Hedgerows is one way of doing it, although hedgerows work a lot better in rural areas, and we used to see a lot of them, not so much now with the big farms, but a hedgerow is kind of harder to establish in an urban area or on a small lot. It's actually a barrier to insects that might overwinter in an uncultivated area near your garden. And it usually consists of a mix of trees, shrubs, and lower growing plants such as grasses and perennials. It can, besides just doing that for your insects, it can act as a windbreak, a privacy screen. It filters out airborne dust. It provides wildlife habitat and increases diversity for pollinators. Some plants that could be used for hedgerows, even if you're going to do a small one in a city. Usually the ideal one is 10 to 12 feet wide, but that's kind of hard to do for most city lots. If you're out in the country, you probably have a greater area where you could do something like this. You might want to include American holly, birch, black-eyed Susans, blueberries, coneflowers, elderberries, meadowsweet, 9-bark, pawpaws, prairie dropseed, redbud, serviceberry, sourwood, sumac, sunflowers, switchgrass, viburnums. Kind of get the idea, all these native plants we have here, anything from annuals to trees. And these provide pollen, nectar, and some of them produce fruits and nesting sites that can attract birds who in turn eat the insects in your garden. I can't remember, I think it's like 6,000 or 8,000 insects a small bird has to provide for its babies in one nesting clutch. So, I mean, they eat a lot of insects. So if you can keep them nearby, that helps too. Otherwise, companion planting low growing cover crops around the perimeter of a garden or under vegetable plants helps. It allows soil covers or living mulches might include that crimson clover we talked about earlier, white clover, oats, cowpeas, thyme, sweet alyssum. And another benefit of living mulches that we haven't talked about before is the fact that they keep the soil from splashing up on the leaves of plants when it rains hard. And a lot of diseases are soil borne, which means they survive in the soil. And when the conditions are right, then if they're splashed up on the leaves of the plants, they start infecting the plants. So again, all of this stuff we talked about is based on diversity. I hope you're getting the idea that if you have all kinds of different plants kind of growing near each other, interspersed with each other, and you know, they all have different things that will help out all those other plants, to put it in a good way. The next thing we're going to talk about, and I know this is getting a little bit long, but we're almost done. Plant partners for biological control. We have what we call good insects and bad insects. The good insects are called beneficial insects, and the bad insects are just bad, pest insects. Good insects control garden pests by being predators, which means they actually eat the garden pest, or they are a parasitoid, which means they lay eggs on usually the larva of a pest, and then the eggs hatch, eat the insides out of the pest larva. Sounds real yummy. And then they make their cocoons or chrysalises or whatever, and hatch and go on to infect other bad bugs. One of the things we can do to encourage good insects is to provide nectar and pollen on the kinds of plants that it's easy to get the pollen out of, and also provide year-round habitat. So we're going to talk a little bit about some things in general here. Biological control is one way of using a living organism to help control the population of another. The biological control, if you've ever heard of people ordering like ladybugs from a garden supply company or lace wings, and so we're using a beneficial insect and releasing it in the garden to control some pest. It's aphids or, you know, white flies or some other pest. This works pretty good in greenhouses, but not so good in home gardens, because you have to have enough of the pests for the insects to stay and keep them supplied with food. Otherwise, they'll move on to somebody else's garden where they have more of the pest insects that you're trying to control. And they may not even stay in your garden at all, even if you do have the pest insects. So that's not a real good one. A better one is to try to get these insects that eat or prey on the bad bugs to just hang around your garden. And the best way to do that is, you know, to keep the pollen and all those sources there. One of our blunders, early ones when we were trying to figure this out, is to introduce the Asian lady beetle to control some tree pests. And now it has become a pest in itself. So now they're much more careful about what they use to control pests by releasing a specific insect to try and do in the pest insect. The third use of biological control that you can do in your garden is to not use pesticides and create a habit that favors the good insects. So the ideal setup is to use this companion or plant partners. And the second way is, instead of cleaning up all the dead plants every fall, leave plants that are not diseased to provide overwintering spots for the good guys. So especially any hollow stemmed plants like milkweed, the native good insects often overwinter in those hollow stems. They overwinter in leaf litter on the ground. They overwinter in the ground under the leaf litter. So it's really important not to clean up your gardens unless they're diseased. You know, if you have like really a disease problem, yes, you need to clean that up. But otherwise, leave your plants standing in the wintertime for the beneficial insects until the weather in the spring is pretty consistently 50 degrees or more. And that allows those beneficial insects to wake up in the spring and get out of the litter before you haul it off to someplace, or better yet, put it in your compost pile. So plant partners for biological control. Lettuce or other greens planted with dill or fennel. The plants in the carrot family have these umbrella-shaped flowers. They're kind of flat, and they have very tiny little flowers with very shallow nectaries. And this is ideal for pests that consume aphids because they don't have like the long proboscis, whatever the thing is, to get into the long tubular flowers. Carrot family plants include dill, fennel, cilantro, caraway, anise, and wildflowers, golden alexanders, that's one wildflower, and angelica. Angelica is quite a big plant though, if you're going to put it in your garden. Golden alexanders are actually a very pretty plant. The insects are attracted to these flowers are the little tiny parasitic wasps, ladybugs, lacewings, spiders, soldier beetles, syrphid flies, minute pirate bugs, damsel bugs, and many others. And those are all the good guys. They eat aphids of all kinds as well as other insects. A great characteristic of these carrot family plants is that they tend to grow tall and slender, so they're very easy to interplant, taking up little space between your other plants. Planting dill with cole crops also helps with cabbage worms. Eggplants with dill or cilantro helps control Colorado potato beetles. Black-eyed Susans or cosmos, those flowers in the aster family, also have the cone type thing surrounded by the petals. And this is a very good form for the insects to eat off of too. Various veggies of the mint family, and most of these are herbs: sage, marjoram, or oregano, lemon balm, rosemary, and thyme. Some of the things that feed on those use the caterpillar stage of the tomato hornworm, the tomato fruitworms, and the diamondback moth larvae to insert their eggs into and use those as incubators for their eggs. So these partners are, plant partners are their favorite hosts. Okay, grapes or lettuce and sweet alyssum. Sweet alyssum is kind of a good plant to plant underneath a lot of garden plants because it's low growing, it's fairly thick. It'll survive in the shade. So that's a good one too. And they attract syrphid flies, also known as hoverflies or flower flies, and the parasitic wasps that eat eggs or use aphids as egg laying plants. So they lay their egg in the aphid, and the egg hatches, eats out the inside of the aphid, pupates in the inside the aphid, and then chews a hole and comes out and is an adult. A plant called Lacey phacelia is a native flower that provides a good shallow nectar source for many bees and hoverflies. These insects feed on cabbage aphids. And let's see. Its only a drawback is that it can readily self-seed if it's not cut down as soon as the petals drop from the oldest flowers. We talked about crimson clover before as being a good plant to plant with a lot of other different things. The minute pirate bug also loves this one, and it eats thrips. So that's a good thing. Plant partners for habitat creation, broccoli and crimson clover. Though technically not insects, spiders are one of the best control creatures in our gardens. Some of them spin webs, but a lot of spiders don't. And what they do is they just prowl around in your garden, eating insects and other nasties as they come upon them. They like this thick foliage of the crimson clover for protection while they're preying on worms of the broccoli plant. Lettuce and bunch grass. Ground beetles are rather ugly bugs. They're kind of black and just kind of, ugh. But anyway, they're great for gardens because they like to hide in thick grass during the day and then come out at night and eat snails and slugs and pest caterpillars and other night creatures. Farmers have created beetle banks by planting a row of perennial bunch grasses for every 3 or 4 rows of crops. Bunch grasses are grasses that don't spread by runners. So they're things like switch grasses, blue stems, and that. The banks are slightly raised rows of grass and that are mowed only once in the fall. Stems are left for winter cover. And while that's kind of unpractical because they're usually quite wide, what vegetable gardeners can do on smaller areas is to plant a beetle bump. And that's a 4-foot circular raised bump that's planted with bunch grass. Place it near your garden. And then you also have these pretty grasses that grow during the summer and into the fall and even into the winter. Switchgrass is pretty good at standing up to the winter snow and stuff. Many vegetables along with low growing plants, no specific plants here, but any low growing plant can provide shelter for spiders, big-eyed bugs, ground beetles, minute pirate bugs, and others. Low growing annuals, herbs, ground covers. Think of things like oregano, sweet alyssum, gem marigolds, tarragon, basket of gold, thyme, or other flowers that flop and hang on the ground, tend to fall over. Those are good ones too. And we talked earlier about the hollow stem perennials to keep those around for the insects to live in the winter time.
Hey, Donna.
Mm-hmm.
I see you have it on here for tomatoes, but we just had somebody in our audience ask specifically, how do you keep your tomatoes healthy? Especially with blight.
Couple things. The more disease resistant variety you can choose if you're having a lot of trouble with diseases, the blights and all that. There are only 1 or 2 tomato varieties to my knowledge that resist septoria leaf spot, and that's a very common one. It causes the spots on the leaves, and then the leaves turn brown and the leaves fall off, and it goes from the bottom to the top of the plant. So disease resistant varieties, space them out, so there's good airflow. As the plant is growing, take off about the bottom 10 to 12 inches of branches or up to the first fruit cluster, so that there's less chance of it splashing up from the ground. Stake them or put them in cages so they're not sprawling on the ground. There are some preventative organic kind of things, like copper sprays that you can use, but you have to start them before you see any disease in order to control it. Trying to think, tomatoes. Those are the major ones. Good air circulation, good mulching, resistant varieties, pruning. Again, that's for better air circulation. Take out those suckers that grow between the leaf and the stem. Well, those are the major ones. Okay, I'll figure out where I am here. Okay. Did I miss one somewhere here? Previous. Yeah, okay. Number 6, disease management. There's only about 5 more slides left. Some plant partners can increase the antifungal compounds in the soil as they decompose. There's not as much research on this particular item as there is on some of the others, but some of the things we can do is supporting beneficial microorganisms, keeping the soil healthy, and the variety of plants means you have a better variety of soil, a better variety of microorganisms, better variety of all of everything, and that all makes the soil better, which makes the plants better. So reducing the splash up effects, trying to limit those insects that carry diseases. We talked about that already. Improving the soil increases overall plant health. Preventing pathogen buildup in the soil. So if you have some plants that control pathogens, those intermix with others, there's going to be less air, less disease and more air circulation. So those are some things just in disease management. Let's see. Potatoes and oats are winter rye to prevent verticillium. And that's a serious disease because if you have that in your garden, you generally can't plant anything else in that area for about 10 years. Potatoes and brassicas, potato scab stays in the soil for the following years. Brassicas produce glucinolates. I didn't practice that one. And they suppress the scab pathogen. Cauliflower or lettuce with brassicas. Brassicas also deter verticillium wilt in cauliflower and stem rot. Tomatoes and hairy vetch. Tomatoes grown after a hairy vetch crop had less disease than those planted through plastic mulch. Hairy vetch is different than the roadside vetch you see, planted in the late summer or fall and cut to the ground just as the pods begin to form, and then plant your tomato plants in the residue. Watermelon, again, Fusarium wilt and hairy vetch used as a cover crop before planting watermelons will reduce the incidence of verticillium wilt, as well as making the melon sweeter. Same thing, planted in this late summer or early fall, and then terminate before it sets seed, and then plant the next year with the watermelons into what's left in the ground there. Beans and several other veggies, even some ornamentals, are subject to bean root rot. That can live in the soil for many years. So if you plant a cover crop in late summer or early fall and mow it down just as the grasses are coming into flower and then leave the residue. Then you plant bead seeds into that mulch, and they are both mildly allelopathic, and the large bean seeds are not as much affected by that as the smaller seeds. And then lastly, we're going to talk some about pollinators. I don't know, but there are 4,000 native bee species in America. This dwarfs the number of European bee species we have been depending on for many years. Bee decline has been an important topic we've talked about for the last 10, 15 years. So if the European bees sort of like die out, we're going to have to depend more on our native pollinator bees. So we need to bolster those. Most of the native bees are solitary. They do not form big colonies. And because they do not have big colonies, they do not feel they have to defend it, so they don't sting. Native bees are much tougher. They will go out and forage in the cold and the rain. European bees don't. They're more effective. It takes 25 orchard mason bees to pollinate an acre of apple trees, and it takes 15 to 20,000 European honeybees to do the same. And the lack of bees of any kind is showing up in like pollination deficiencies in many of the plants we have. So in order to keep the bees around, we need to have them. And not only do they pollinate, but they also do something. Tomatoes, pepper plants, and eggplants, and some of the large hooded flowers are self-fertile, which means you don't have to have a bee in order to make a tomato or pepper. But the pollen is kind of sticky, especially when the weather gets hot. And bees, when they land on those flowers, they do what's called buzz pollinating. They vibrate their flight muscles very fast. That loosens the pollen and allows the plant to pollinate itself. Because bumblebees are large and they need these sturdy flowers to land on, they're the good bees for doing that. And so they're the only bees that are capable of opening the flowers of snapdragons, baptisia, monkshood, and lupines, and many other family plants of the pea and bean families. So blueberries and crimson clover. Crimson clover is particularly rich in nectar. So that brings in pollinators, especially bumblebees and mining bees to your blueberries. Squash, the more squash you have, the better, because that brings in more bees to pollinate. Many veggie flowers and flowering herbs and annuals, they all go good together. Greens and root crops are cosmos, sunflowers and daisies. Let's see. Kale, collards, mustard greens, cabbage, radishes, parsnips, rutabagas, they all need to be pollinated by insects to get seeds. So we need the bees and other pollinators for that. And of course, we all know about flowering plants and fruit trees. If you don't get them pollinated, they don't produce anything. Some people want to use mason bee nest or mason bee houses, but we're really better off letting them do their thing in hollow stems, because when you have a whole bunch of those together, that also brings in other predators of the mason bees and invites disease to be transferred from one of those tubes to another more easily. So it's not always the best thing. Let's see. Another important pollinator bee that does cherries, plums, peaches, and that sort of thing is the mining bee. That excavates a solitary hole in the ground and also emerges early. So you need to keep those around by providing nectar sources from the spring through the fall, not just those fruit trees in the summer. Let's see.
Okay.
I think I've talked long
Hey, Donna.
enough. Yeah,
Well, we have a question. Are like
yeah.
hornets and those types of insects like pollinators too? And like the ground bees?
Oh, yeah. A lot of times when people talk about ground bees, they're actually talking about a wasp.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are not to the extent of some of the other native bees we have though, but yes, they do contribute some. And there's some of the beneficial insects that are called wasps, but they're usually the really small ones. They're not thinking of the ball-faced hornet or any of those. But those kinds of big wasps, they also eat other insects too. That's their diet. So, if they are eating some of these pest insects, it's probably better to leave the nest until they die in the fall. The nest will die out and it won't be there the next year. And leave those, to pollinate and to eat the bad insects and that sort of thing. Rather than try to take down the nest, unless it's in a place where people are nearby, and it's a danger to people being stung. But yeah, they do some pollinating also. We talked about most of this stuff earlier on this last screen, so I'm not going to read it all again. So any other questions? I know this was one of the longer ones, but I tried to condense a whole book into an hour and a half.
No, I think you did good, Donna. And we don't have any questions here. So if anybody online has any, stick them in that Q&A or the chat and we'll get them answered quick.
And I know the library has the book. And there's several copies available from loan from other libraries in the system too. So if you want to check out the book, it's quite an easy read. It's got a lot of pretty pictures. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff at all, take a look at it. I think the book is $17 or something if you want to get your own copy.
Yeah, now is the good time to look at it before the rush of gardening and further in the spring.
Yeah.
What book was you going of that Plant Partner Science?
Yes. Yep. It's Plant Partners, right? That's actually the title.
Partners, Jessica Wallace it should be on the handout, the resource handout.
Yep. Well, I think that's it, Donna. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, even if it wasn't in person. We still really appreciate you doing that.
I feel bad because we actually had people there in person. Sometimes we don't get anybody in person.
Yeah, so we just have to quick sit together or just do it online. So no, and next month we're doing sowing seeds, right? Indoor sowing and outdoor.
Yep, seed starting and winter sowing.
Yeah, and we're handing out free tomato seeds.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I thought it was like the collation of like.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm glad I had to, because I was thinking it's a different lecture, but.
Yeah, yep. They're celebrating the Wisconsin 55 tomato with one seed, one Wisconsin. So we're handing out Wisconsin 55 tomato seeds. So
There's a little man in town